Welcome to Isaiah chapter 2. As you may remember, the book of Isaiah has a prologue, and the prologue is really chapters 1 to 5. Chapters 1 to 5 is not in any chronological order of how Isaiah's prophecy came to him. It was rearranged in a theological way in order to introduce some of the topics that we'll see from chapter 6 on to chapter 66. So we're in the middle of the prologue, and one of the themes that is going to be developed throughout the book later on is the whole idea of pride, the pridefulness of human beings, and how that becomes a stumbling block to their worship. And that is exactly the theme that is being introduced here in chapter 2. But chapter 2 is organized in an interesting way. It has two very specific sections. Verse 1 to 5 talks about a future reality, and we'll have a look at that now. And then we'll look at verse 6 to 22 that talks about how Isaiah is seeing the current state of the pridefulness of Judah and Israel, and how that is not very helpful for their worship of God. So it starts here with a vision, and the vision has the last days in mind. Verse 2, in the last days the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established. Now the last days in Jewish theology is the day when God will come again in judgment at the end of time. Now oftentimes we know that the prophets have a view of the future, but they don't have a particular time frame in which that all of those events will necessarily happen. So they may see a whole lot of events unfolding, and they seem to think that they are all going to unfold at the same time. So Isaiah here would see the last days, and he would think that all of these things will happen at the same time, right at the end of time. But for many New Testament theologians, this is not necessarily the case. The last times, the last days, refers to a period of time later, obviously in future for Isaiah, but it doesn't necessarily have to be right at the end of days when God returns. And we'll see that many people think that particular last days have actually been inaugurated at the coming of Jesus Christ. But I'll come back to that in a minute. But what does Isaiah exactly see happen at the last days? Well, first of all, the mountain of the Lord's temple is a big theme that will be developed, especially in the last days. It is said that the mountain of the Lord is the highest, is the place where people will come together in this ideal future. It is what God is aiming all of creation to come to. The mountain of the Lord is the place where all nations will eventually see true worship, the true one God, and they will stream there. So the temple, the mountain of the Lord's temple, the mountain of the Lord, the temple itself, verse 3, is the place where people will come. That mountain is called Zion or Jerusalem. The Old Testament uses both of those for the same kind of thing. And in Revelation, we also see that the new Jerusalem and Zion is interchanged. They represent the final wonderful reality of when God will be praised and glorified and acknowledged, and every tongue will acknowledge and every knee will bow. And they will do that in the new Jerusalem. So there's a whole theology, a Zion theology, or a Jerusalem theology, behind this that is being developed by the prophets in the Old Testament. A day, the reason for this is because they, even after the exile, when people returned, they realized that this vision that they've had is not being realized. There is no time that has come, even after they've returned from the exile, where the mountain of the Lord's temple is being revered by all nations. So they've developed this theology that Zion and Jerusalem will be in the last days. And as I said, for New Testament theologians, and definitely in our Reformed theology, when this came true, it was inaugurated, these last days, in Jesus' resurrection. When Jesus was resurrected, it enabled all the nations. And we see that in Acts, all nations, not just the Jews, got saved. They were all invited and into the people of God. And that is when the last days started. So we are in the last days, the days between God's first coming and his second coming, the resurrection and his second coming, the parousia, as they call it. So what will happen in these last days? Well, the Lord will establish, the temple of the Lord will be established as the highest mountains. Now, some of these things will happen right at the end of days when God does come, and I think this is one of them. God's hill, the church, his message will be exalted above all other religions. Nations will stream to it in their miraculous numbers. And I think also that has definitely started to happen since Jesus' resurrection, but it will come to fruition and in completion at the end of days. Many people will come to understand who God really is, and I think that has already happened. That has started to happen. So verse 2, I think, I can certainly see how that is true from Jesus' resurrection through the missionary efforts of the church worldwide up until today. Many people have come. Verse 4, I think we can say that this will, in the way that it is described, will also only happen at the end of time, when Jesus comes the second time, when God will judge between nations, and he will settle finally the disputes for many people. Nation will not take up sword against nation. And I think that is only going to happen after God has come and judged fairly across all nations, not just the Jews, but the whole world will know that he is God, and he will be the judge of all of them. He is the universal God, the God of the one true God that will reign over not just Israel and their territory, but over all of the earth. And what will he do? What will he do during that end days? God will teach us his ways. He will teach us so that we may walk in his ways. We will have the knowledge, but we will also have the ability to walk in his light. He will judge, which is a very clear theme throughout Isaiah, and he will settle disputes, and that is something that we can all look forward to. Now, all of this, so this is the ideal future in which Isaiah is saying that the people of Israel should really put their hope in. This is what they should strive for, and because of that, they must get rid of their idols, get rid of their pride, and so on. So this is the ideal future. This is what life is going to look like in the last days. What is very interesting about verse 2 to 4 is that word for word you will find this these verses also in Micah. Micah 4 verse 1 to 3, word for word, copy and paste. Now there's a couple of suggestions from theologians as to why this is. Obviously they were contemporaries, they were prophets during the same time of Israel's history. So the one may have written it and the other one said, that's a great idea, I'll borrow it from you. Or what could have happened is that they both had access to a third piece of writing, a third piece of literature that they both used and said, but this is something that is theologically true, and it fits in with the message of hope, restoration, and so on that God has given them. So one of the couple of passages in the Bible that is being used word for word by two separate prophets. So the first section, from verse 1 to 5, speaks of an ideal future reality that should shape our lives today. And that is most certainly what Isaiah is trying to communicate to the Israelites. He knows that all people should bring honor to God and should worship Him. But he is also very aware that there's certain things that stands in the way, in the heart of the Israelites, as he knows, and that is pride. So verse 6 till verse 11 speaks about what Israel is full of. They are full of superstitions. They are full of divination, full of pagan customs. They are a land that is full of silver and gold. There is no end to their treasures. They are full of horses. There's no end to their chariots. Now, silver and gold obviously refers to wealth. Horses and chariots refers to military might. There is no end to their money. There's no end to their chariots. But that in itself became so important to them that it became an idol. So the land is not just full of silver and full of gold, it is also full of superstition, full of idols. And what will that lead to? The people will be brought low, and everyone will be humbled. Full of silver, full of gold, full of idols means that they are proud. They are arrogant about their amount of money, their amount of how their achievements, military achievements. And Isaiah is seeing a day that they will be brought low and humbled. And the reason why they will be humbled is because of verse 10. He sees that the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of His majesty will make their fullness, their pride, crumble, and they will be low and humbled in His presence. Now this idea, that exact phrase is being repeated again in verse 19. Fearful presence of the Lord, the splendor of His majesty. That is the turning point. Again in verse 21, the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of His majesty. In light of His presence, His fearful presence, in light of His splendor, of His majesty, nothing that humans can achieve will ever look the part. It will crumble, it will be made low, it will be cut down in light of this fearful presence of the Lord. There's no competition there. Only the Lord will be glorified and exalted in the end of the day. The verses 6 to 8 speaks then of Israel is full. They are full of earthly stuff, but they are empty in their worship. So that brings us to the meaning block B from verse 6 to verse 11. Humanity that is full of pride, but will be made low by God's presence. It is the stumbling block that will stop them from putting their hope in this ideal future, which is really where their security should lie. But their security lies in human pride, all of their money and all of their military might. Verse 12 to 21, 22 speaks about the same thing. It talks about the pride of Israel, but this time he doesn't call it fullness. He speaks of it as being tall. They think they're tall. They think they are lofty. Tall and lofty they see themselves. They see themselves as towering mountains. In very strong contrast to verse 2, where it says that the mountain of the Lord will be established as the highest mountain. But it is the people who are arrogant and say that they think their mountain will be the high hill and worthy to be worshipped at. They think they are lofty towers. They think they are fortified walls. They think in verse 16 that they are trading ships, stately vessels, very grand, very powerful, very influential. But all of this is arrogance. And God hates arrogance. He hates human pride. And what will happen to it in verse 12, that slightly underlined word, what God hates is the proud. So what he will do to the proud when he appears in his fullness and in his splendor is that he will make them humble, verse 12. He will bring them low, verse 17. They will be brought low. They will be humbled, verse 17. Their idols, the false hope that they have in their own ability, will totally disappear in verse 18. So what verse 12 to 15 talks about is that Israel thinks that they are tall, but they will be made low. And who will do this? Who will make them humble? It is the Lord, verse 6. From verse 6 right through to 21, it is the appearance of the Lord that will make the difference. Verse 12, the Lord Almighty. Verse 17, the Lord alone. Verse 19 is the fearful presence of the Lord. Verse 21, the fearful presence of the Lord. He will be the one that will make them humble. Simply by appearing. He doesn't do much. He simply has to arrive. And that will humiliate, humble, and dash their view of themselves in light of the presence of a holy God. So this is what the last meaning block, the summary of it is that the proud and the lofty humanity will be cut low by the presence of the Lord. Now verse 22 is the heart, is the summary of verse 6 to 21. Stop trusting in mere humans who have but a breath in their nostrils. Why hold them in esteem? He has gone to great lengths to say from verse 6 till 21, this is what stops you from striving for the ideal future, and stop treating men like they are something. this idea is being repeated over and over again in scriptures, and it would be great to reference Psalm 62 verse 9 and Psalm 146 verse 3. And I pray that this ideal future is something that we will find our security in. We will be humbled, and that's exactly what Micah 6 verse 8 is also saying to us. We should walk humbly with our Lord simply because we realize who He really is. May that be a truth that drives our relationship with God.